My least favorite game of all time in the AAA space is a tough one because I don't really hate a lot of AAA games. I think there are design practices that have entered AAA games that because that game was big or successful or did what it did, I think it did it pushed us in a direction as developers that I'm not a big fan of. One of the biggest of those is going to be the Uncharted series, as much as I did 100% all of these games. So again, it's not really a hate, but it's a mental space that ended up sort of carrying through, not just to Last of Us, but bleeding through in how we do storytelling is the sort of manipulated linearity of Uncharted. Uncharted is a hyperlinear story-based game. They do that very well. The challenge becomes that what makes the game work is the mystery of you feeling like you're doing something you're not supposed to, or not realizing that the designers of the game have laid out the track in front of you. When they very much have, every single thing is calculated, from the truck busting through the wall because you went down a path you thought you weren't supposed to, all the way to how you cleverly climb around things that makes think like you shouldn't. These things started in a very particular place and then ended up in a place where games are now, in order to even be slightly competitive in the storytelling or adventure genre, which once included games like Monkey Island or Maniac Mansion, now his budget's in the $225 million realm to even be slightly competitive and be able to tell the stories that ultimately end up being told almost better in film. I would also say with this, there's also the other mechanic that comes from the Diablos of the world. And Diablo is very much in that AAA space. Diablo and The Division and bullet sponge shooters of sort of any type, any game that relies on stat increases as you play, the loop and the loot loop that plays within that is, to me, something that is about tricking the player into believing they've made progress. Cookie Clicker and Diablo are basically the same game. Underneath it, there's a slight bit of better management in Diablo and higher polish. But the thing that it shares with Uncharted is ultimately there is a hyperlinear everything to what's happening. There is a single best and most efficient way to min-max and play Diablo. This is the reason builds in Diablo every season are very specific. There is one that wins. There's one that sets up. And while there is room to play in the externalities of that, or you can play within the externalities of how combat plays or be slightly better at shooting in Uncharted, as long as you're passable in any of those elements, you get a chance to actually make your way through a AAA game, beat it, and come away expecting more of that and wanting more of that from everyone else. And to me, that's the stuff I hate. When you start talking about, like, I mean, any game series, it gets troubling because a lot of people overrate or talk about, overrating the most popular ones. When you talk about something like Call of Duty, everyone in the world wants to shit on Call of Duty. They want to shit on Madden. They want to shit on Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, which are all, I think, targets that you could go after. But ultimately, I'm not sure any of them are overrated at large. The one, though, I think would definitely stand out as something that I believe is overrated would be the Metal Gear Solid series. I do enjoy the games, and I think there's a lot of great stuff in them, but there's an odd sort of mental space around Kojima and what he brings to games that I appreciate at the same time as I kind of have a disdain for the sort of idea of this auteur theory, which I don't sort of believe in at all. The Metal Gear series is incredibly poorly written and conceived of almost from beginning to end. The storylines are nonsensical and laughable to the point where there are even memes within the fan communities of these games of how silly or nonsensical they are. Character names are stupid, over the top. It's hack writing from the beginning. And inside of them, you find games that have occasional really interesting mechanics. The mechanics, refined to a point, is really where Kojima does his best work. It's where, if freed, he does the best things he can do. And you see that sort of all the way through to even Death Stranding, which has that same sheen of, oh my God, this game is genius. This is something that people don't understand. I've been mocked and laughed at for simply not having enjoyed what I consider to be a sort of wonky, navel-gazing game that doesn't have a lot of fun in it. Overall, you end up with some fun mechanics that you can learn and play with, and cool systems that you can mess with, that really sort of take their logical end. And it's the part where I'm conflicted when I talk about it, because things like in Solid Snake, where Snake Eater, where you're up against a guy who's an old sniper, and if you just allow time to pass in the game, he dies of old age. Brilliant little things of how these systems interplay. The first time I ever fought Psycho Mantis, it blew my mind because it was playing with systems at large. Those are the moments that make these things sort of stick with us. The fact they're ensconced inside of a sort of semiotic structure that is at best childish and at worst hacky, I think ultimately does a massive disservice to it. So when you talk about these sort of overhyped, extremely beloved games that ultimately I have a hard time recommending to almost anyone, I think Kojima's games go to the top of that list for sure. I'm just finishing my 15th hour in Starfield, and I'm just going to say Starfield. It's going to be, I think almost everything from Bethesda is going to start falling into this when I start talking about why I have the issue, and why I find this game to sort of be in the position that it's in. It had so much potential. There's ungodly amounts of money and people and talent behind it. I know people who worked on the game. They're some of my favorite people as humans, but they're also incredibly talented and care about the work they're doing and love the work that they're doing. And whenever you get those people in a place where they have this much, the question then becomes, how do you end up with a product that is at best just more of the same? Starfield isn't actually anything new. It is Fallout 4 in space. Now, I happen to be someone who likes the sort of Bethesda formula for like relaxing my brain and sitting on the couch playing, having a beer, having a joint, and just going like that. But the reality around the entirety of the game is it is linear quest after linear quest that doesn't allow deviation. There's fewer moments of sort of any semblance of freedom. When you have a game called Starfield, when you're building a new universe from the ground up, when you promise me the ability to go anywhere and do anything, when you have that sort of potential, which outer space always does, it is a frontier that hasn't been crossed, and you deliver on less than that, that there is basically no difference between basically calling this a mod of Fallout would not be wild. It's prettier, sure. It has a lot more content, yes. But it is, I go place, I can walk around, I fast travel, I go through doors, load time. I go through doors, load time. But the load time takes me from not, world to dungeon or world to building, but it takes me from world to ship to world. And it's the same load times. It's the same structure. It's the same everything. And the lack of follow through on what was an exceptionally overhyped and incredibly talent filled game, I've found to be just on the wrong side of frustrating. The inability to fail quests where people can't die because the quest doesn't allow you to. It doesn't allow it to happen. The mechanics around stealth being somehow worse than any other of the Bethesda games. The inability for me to really forge my own. Instead, I have to do so in such a tiny, specifically linear way. I think has been a deep disappointment through my entire playthrough.